Hi everyone. So we're back and we just assigned a material to one of our objects and we're going to assign a material to the second one using the same process. So I'm going to right click and hold over the sphere here, assign a new material, and again we want to use Vray surface and then we want to use the material that says Vray MTL. Now it's tempting here as you're looking at these materials to say, well, you know, I mean I might want Vray car paint or something like that. Or, you know, any of the other options here. The thing to remember is that the default Vray MTL is extremely powerful. And you can make just about anything using the default Vray material if you know how to adjust the settings here. And that's really what we're going to learn. So stick with the basic Vray material for now. And, you know, it's possible later on to make some changes, but this is going to be the set of settings that you're going to be most comfortable with by the end of the semester. So let's start by selecting the object on the left, or one of our objects anyway, and you know we can give it a name here. So I'll name this dumbbell, since that is kind of the shape. And the first setting that we're interested in here is the overall color of our object. So if I click on diffuse color, it'll bring up a color picker menu, and you'll see that I'm able to change the color of the object. And let's just make this sort of a light blue for now. Now that's not very exciting. We can change the color on a lot of different materials, but we really haven't changed any of its sort of properties here other than the color. You can see here it pretty much still looks a lot like its neighbor shape. The big thing that's going to change the object is going to be a setting not under basic parameters here. And by the way, stick with just the settings that I'm showing you how to use here. So there are a lot of other sliders that you're going to be tempted to use. Stay away from these because they can very easily screw up the material. The reason a lot of these other sliders are here is for more complex material processes. So if you stick with the settings that I'm going with here, you'll be able to create a lot of varied materials. But trust me, you don't want to mess with the other ones right now, like self-illumination and opacity map and amount. Just right now, the diffuse color is what we're interested in, and under the basic parameters. Now, we're going to move on, though, to the Reflection tab. And the Reflection tab is where we control the shininess of the object. So right now, this object is completely non-reflective. And one way to think about how reflection and a lot of the settings work in Vray is you'll notice there's a setting here that says Reflection Color, and the color is set to black. Watch what happens as we set this color to white. You'll see that immediately the object becomes shiny. You can think of reflection color almost as though it's an on-off switch, right? Like, so when something is set to black, it can't reflect any color at all because black is sort of, you know, it's basically not emitting anything. But when we set it to gray, for example, we get a little bit more reflection. And when we set it to white, we get a lot more reflection. So that's important, reflection color. And I wouldn't really change this color at all, just keep it somewhere between black, white, and gray. You don't want to change the color of the reflection because the idea here is that white will reflect all different kinds of colors. So like if I have a red light, it will reflect as red. If I have a blue light, it will reflect as blue. And if I have a white light, it will reflect as white if my reflection color is set to white. So essentially when you set your reflection color to white, it means it reflects all colors that are shining off of it. The next tab that we're interested in is glossiness. And glossiness is exactly what you'd think it is. If we turn this knob down from 1, you'll see that our object starts to get more matte. And you can see we can get a nice setting somewhere in between. And it won't look like fake shiny plastic as much. So if we turn that down a little bit, we've got something like that. So that looks pretty good. And basically what we've just created now would be sort of something like shiny plastic, right? And that is good. That's basically the easiest material to create in Vray. And it's also very simple to render as well. But obviously not all objects in this world are plastic, right? We need to kind of create a little bit more variety to make things interesting for us. And so the other two materials we're going to learn how to create here are glass and metal. And for a couple of, you know, let's look at metal next. And for metal, we'll do our other object here. So I'll switch to my sphere, and I'll actually just name this object metal sphere. So metal has some funny properties to it. And these are the types of properties where you're just going to need to memorize some of what I'm doing here in the attribute editor. The first thing that we need to think about for metal is that it reflects light very differently than something like plastic. In other words, it has areas that are really shiny and very reflective, and then it has areas that might just register as kind of very, very dark and black. For that reason, we need to turn the diffuse color very dark to start out with. So I'm going to take my diffuse color here up under my basic parameters and turn this to a dark gray. And right now I'm just going to be creating like a chrome. So gray is kind of perfect for chrome because chrome is not really a colored metal. It's just a sort of neutral. Then we need to turn our reflection color up all the way to white. So let's do that. And there we go. So now we have a white reflection color. Now right now this still pretty much looks just like our shiny plastic from before because we really haven't changed anything about it. In fact, it's so shiny that we can actually see the individual shapes of the lights that are reflecting off of the objects, right? So the next step is going to be to change the way that this object is actually reflecting light. So right now it's reflecting light like the way that plastic reflects light. But we want this to reflect light the way that metal reflects light. And to do this, there are some numbers that we need to punch in to a couple of settings here. The one that we're interested in is this little checkbox down here under reflection that says lock Fresnel IOR to refraction IOR. Now, there's a few new vocabulary words here that may be of interest. The first is Fresnel. So what is Fresnel? Fresnel is a kind of the name of a French mathematician, and this mathematician discovered the way that light kind of bounces off things differently depending on the angle of the light and the properties of the object. So, you know, think to, like, for example, if you were staring at a long distant highway in the desert and you see what looks like water or a mirage appear at the end of the highway. One reason you might see something like that is that at a very oblique angle, certain objects can be very highly reflective. So even though, for example, blacktop or asphalt isn't a reflective surface, if you get low enough and you stare at it from far enough away, it can appear to reflect light. And that's basically what a Fresnel is. And IOR stands for Index of Refraction. So what that means is that's sort of just a number that describes the Fresnel, basically. So like the Fresnel IOR is different for plastic than it is for, say, metal, and we need to punch in a specific number. So to do that, we need to uncheck this box. And we need to change this number right here from 1.6 to something between 25 and 30. So if I put in the number 25, you'll see that immediately my object has very different reflective properties. All of a sudden now it looks a lot more like chrome. And that's what we're interested in here. I'm also going to bring the glossiness down a little bit on this so that it doesn't look so kind of high polished chrome. And now that looks a little bit more like a metal surface. And that's pretty much exactly what we want. So that's metal. And to change some of the properties of the metal from here, the best thing to do is to change the reflection color and the diffuse color. So if I wanted to say create gold, I would change the reflection color here to a light yellow. And you can see that we start to get something that looks a little bit more like gold, but not quite. To finish the job, we need to change the diffuse color here to something like a dark brown. So I would bring this color closer to black, and we get something more like that. There we go. So that's kind of a more or less gold kind of material. So those are metals. And now let's create one last material. Let's look at glass. Now I'm saving this for last because glass is maybe one of the trickier materials. So I'm just going to make a copy of my my object here, and I'm going to slide this back in space. And I'm going to assign a different material to the object in the foreground here. So I'm going to go to Assign New Material, and again select Vray material. So now we have our classic Vray gray material, and we'll call this material glass. So now glass in order to create glass, we have to use a tab called refraction. Refraction, if you remember from maybe your earth sciences class, is just the idea of it describes how light moves through something. So reflection is how things bounce off of the surface, and refraction is how light moves through a surface. So that's why we need it to describe glass. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to turn the diffuse color all the way off. So we've got black. And you can see that when I do that, if I don't have any reflections turned on, this just looks like a complete black void. So we need to turn some reflections on. So I'm going to turn my reflection color up. And I'll select white for that. So now we've got shiny black plastic again. And now we can move on to the refraction tab. So refraction color is a lot like reflection color. If I turn this up, to white, that will make my object transparent. So let's do that. So you can see as soon as I move that towards white, I get transparency in my object here. Now, on your computers at school, I have a relatively powerful computer here. This is going to take a while to render. In fact, on an average iMac, refraction and transparency is as they say, an expensive calculation. So you kind of don't want to get in the habit of using a lot of refraction if you don't have to. Now you'll also see that one thing about this object right now is that it looks like it was made out of a solid hunk of glass. And that's fine. That might be the case, right, if we were creating like a solid piece of glass. But in a lot of cases, we're going to have, like, say if we were creating a glass bottle, the glass bottle is not going to be solid glass. It's going to have a hollow middle. And you'll notice that if we actually model this differently, the refraction will be very, very different as well. So let me show you what I mean. So right now we've got a solid thing. And I'm going to go back and I'm going to add a little bit of thickness to this object. So I'm going to select the object, go to my Poly Modeling tab, and just extrude a little bit and create a slight local translate Z offset to this. So I'm just going to set this to like 0.02. And you'll notice now my object has a little bit of thickness. It actually is no longer solid all the way through. So for example, if we were to zoom in here, you'd see that we've got actually a little bit of depth. And now, when I render this, it actually renders in a way that looks like we've got a hollow piece of glass. And I would say 9 times out of 10, this is probably the more desirable effect. You know, a lot more often students will be interested in rendering, say, like the headlight of a car or a glass bottle or something along those lines, or a light bulb. And all of those objects are sort of hollow pieces of glass. And so you just want to make sure that when you're rendering glass, that you're sort of aware of kind of like the fact that, or whether or not the object is hollow or solid through the center. And then from there, we can make some more material adjustments. So I can select the object, go to my attribute editor, select the material, and obviously we can adjust the refraction color, and that can actually, so if we wanted colored glass, you can see that we can get colored glass by doing that, and that's pretty handy. There's also a little bit more complex things you can do with the glass as well. So instead of just coloring the glass, we can actually make the glass foggy by sort of adjusting the glossiness of the refraction. So now you'll see that my glass is not exactly shiny in the center. So this would be kind of like if you want frosted glass on the inside, but you want the outer part of the glass to be a different shininess. So you can see I'm getting shiny reflections on my object, but inside the glass is kind of frosty and sort of almost milky in a way. That's refraction glossiness. You sort of have to be careful with this setting. I would recommend just leaving it off most of the time, or setting it to 1, and then you'll get a nice crisp interior. And if you want this to be kind of matte, you can always adjust the reflection glossiness a little bit. But maybe the most important ones for glass are going to be fog color here. And we can also look really quickly at refraction IOR. So what that is, as I was mentioning before, there are, if we go online, certain settings. So if I go and I search Vray IOR, it will bring up a table. And this is actually a pretty good one here. And you can actually look through here, and it will give you the IOR values of various materials. So if I want glass, for example, it has an index of refraction of 1.5. And so if we want this glass to be more physically accurate, we can set our refraction IOR here to 1.5. It's a subtle difference sometimes. Sometimes it makes a meaningful impact on the way that your glass looks, but it's always a good idea to kind of look up, if you've got any kind of material that you're working with, to look up its index of refraction. Okay, so let's look at fog color here. So fog color is like, let's say I've got a piece of glass and it has varying thicknesses to it. Fog color will allow you to have the color of the glass change based on how thick it is. So if we open up fog color here and I select a color like, say, red, you can see that I'm getting pretty much the same kind of coloration as I did on my other object. And one of the reasons, when I just selected refraction color up here, so you might be wondering what the difference is. Well, right now the thickness of my object is totally consistent because I have that shell, right? I extruded a little bit of depth on this. But if I were to, let's assign that same glass material to the object that is solid. So if we bring this guy back out in front, and I move this one into the back, and I reassign, or I assign the glass material to this one. And to assign that glass material to this object, all I need to do is right-click and hold, and scroll down to Assign Existing Material. And then I'll see the names of my materials there, and I can assign glass to it. And now you'll see, with my solid glass, with my solid object that doesn't have a shell to it, you can see that the fog color is pretty interesting because it gets dark where the object is very thick, and it gets lighter where the object is really thin. So it sort of simulates, you know, kind of a more physically accurate type of colored glass. It's pretty cool. And so if I want to change that color yet again, let's bring up my fog color. Maybe make this a little bit lighter. It might be easier to see kind of some of the stuff that it's up to. And you can also change some of the fog color properties here under fog multiplier. So I could kind of turn the multiplier here up and down, and the effect will become more or less pronounced. Okay, so that's fog color. And that's basically how to kind of work with glass, metal, and plastic. And these materials are kind of the sort of standard fare for us for the rest of the semester. So it'll be really important to kind of know how to do these three things. And, you know, trust me on this, there's a lot more to materials than we are kind of digging into. This is basically just scratching the surface of possibilities here when it comes to assigning materials to these things. But even with the this limited set that we've got right now, you can do quite a bit.